At last, we arrive at the setting where the climax of episode 5 occurs. The site of the trial. Apparently, the time is July of 1987. At an expert witness table are seated Legasov, Homyuk, and Shabina, who are primed to blow the socks off the Soviet system with their truth-telling in the name of RBMK and industry reforms. This did not happen in reality, and people like Legasov and Shabina were not even in attendance. The point of the trial was to convict scapegoats, which did happen. Rewind the clock a year earlier, however, to July of 1986, and there was a place where Legasov and Shabina were present. A Politburo meeting at the highest level of the Soviet government. This meeting ends up mirroring the courtroom developments. Shabina is the speaker presenting and explaining. He begins by blaming the operators and ensuring it's understood they are the primary culprits. No one contests this, albeit the focus shifts. At the bottom of page 4, he mentions the positive scram effect, referring to imperfections in the control and protection system. The top of page 5 features an interesting paragraph. The designers are the ones objecting to certain measures to elevate the safety of nuclear power plants. Then Shabina starts talking about deficiencies in the nuclear power industry. In one paragraph, on page 6, he sinks the premise of HBO's show trial. RBMK reactors are potentially dangerous. We must take immediate measures to streamline the procedure of their operation and undertake work on improving their design. Such measures have been drafted, considered by the Commission, and their realisation has been started, although their implementation will lower the economic numbers of the blocks. Let me talk about the specific measures later. Mind you, this is taking place at the beginning of July 1986, rather than in July 1987. Shabina goes back to discussing industry deficiencies, as well as reforms. So, why are we bothering analysing the rest of episode 5? Well, for one, it gives us an opportunity to juxtapose lies and false claims with higher quality information, showing how the disaster was twisted to contain its political consequences. You blame it on the operators and try to move on. But 2, it shows us the power of mis- and disinformation. Remember, Craig Mazin, the show's American creator, was not sympathetic to the Soviet system, yet he still fell for many of its lies, despite knowing he was dealing with lies. This demonstrates how insidious and powerful mis- and disinformation can be, and it's to some measure humorous too. Irony is fun. So, we're back to Legasov wiping sweat from his brow in the courtroom, and the single useless fan in the corner going ting 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 ting. Mazin is making fun of the path of Leninist principles shall be consistently and undeviatingly followed as it expresses the vital interests of the Soviet people. Then we get into the really fun stuff. As Stepashin recites the charges, Homyuk leans in to whisper to Legasov. He puts a hand up. Yes, he sees them. Legasov glances over his shoulder and we see 6 people, 4 men, 2 women, seated together in the audience. Men and women he knows. Scientists. The invisible jury. Comrade Shabina steps up. Shabina claims that the management of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant received awards on the basis of implying it had completed the rundown test. This is the same test the Minister of the Ministry of Media Machine Building, Efim Slavsky, referred to as a completely senseless experiment, the need for which he couldn't understand. The same test that hadn't been attempted, let alone completed, anywhere else than at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, and that apparently other nuclear power plants wrote out of their regulations. And the same test the director of the Leningrad nuclear power plant declined to do, and that no one could force him to do. Observe what HBO Shabina says at the end of his minor part. The science is strong, but a test is only as good as the men carrying it out. Then he brings up how the test was attempted multiple times, with the last being on the night of the explosion. This is one of the sins of the miniseries. In multiple instances, it implies things its writers and creators don't understand. The implication here is that there is nothing wrong with the test, but a whole lot wrong with the managers of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. That's why it failed multiple times, and that's why the reactor will explode at the end of the final attempt. As if to prove their own staggering ineptitude, the scriptwriters bring up Pamyat next, who's about to put her foot in her mouth. Pamyat tells us that to understand what happened on the night of the disaster, we have to understand the events of the preceding day. She glances at her scientific colleagues, wishing she could tell them the truth herself, but that has to be Legasov. Instead, she is about to make them facepalm with her ignorance of circumstances and basic nuclear science. She proceeds to say, by 2 in the afternoon, the reactor power has been lowered by half from its normal output of 3200 megawatts to 1600 megawatts. In fact, by 4 in the morning on the 25th of April 1986, the reactor power was lowered to 1600 megawatts, and maintained in the range of 1500 to 1600 throughout the rest of the day. The inattentiveness of Pamyat to this detail will pull the rug from under the narratives she's introducing, as we will see in the next video. At 2 in the afternoon, or 10 whole hours after the power was reduced to 1600 megawatts, comes the beginning of the Kiev delay. Pamyat claims the Kiev delay created 2 essential problems. One was scientific in nature, or subjectively scientific as we're going to find out, and the other was human in nature. She starts with the human problem created by the Kiev delay. There is a shift change, her voiceover proclaims. God could have offered the rejoinder. At what time? Detail really isn't Pamyat's strong suit. What do we mean by that? Pamyat is trying to make the point that the night shift was unexpectedly thrust into a very difficult position, compounded by the inexperience of the senior reactor control engineer, Leonid Toptonov. To get that latter point across, we encounter the following in the script. Toptonov, look at him, he's too young to drive. He's got more hair on his face than on his balls. The men laugh. Yevchenko points at Toptonov's moustache. Hair? Is that what's on his lip? More laughter. Toptonov shakes his head. Come on, guys. Here is the actor, and here is the actual Toptonov. His colleagues would have needed to have seen his balls in order to make the comparison. Then we move on to the test. At the bottom of page 22 of the episode 5 script, we see another major error of inattentiveness. A claim that the power level at the beginning of the night shift was 1600 megawatts. One might think that if one didn't know when the night shift began, and didn't compare that time with, say, an INSAG 7 timeline as the one found on page 53 of the document. At 2310, the power reduction resumed from a power level of 15 to 1600 megawatts. At 5 minutes past midnight, the power level is noted as being at 720 megawatts. When did Akimov's night shift start? Even Grigory Medvedev's Chernobyl notebook gets this right. At 2310 hours, Tregub was the chief of the shift at Unit 4 at that time, reduction of power was resumed. At 2400 hours, Tregub turned the shift over to Alexander Akimov, and the senior engineer for management of the reactor, SIUR for short, turned the shift over to Leonid Toptonov. So, how does episode 5 of the miniseries have Toptonov and Akimov performing a power reduction from 1600 megawatts? Because Grigory Medvedev, goon that he is, writes the following 3 pages later. It is precisely these qualities that were displayed in Dyatlov to their full extent, when with the local automatic control turned off, SIUR Leonid Toptonov was unable to hold the reactor at a power of 1500 megawatts and let it slip to 30 megawatts thermal. Why does it matter what the power level was when the night shift and Toptonov assumed control? The script shows an ugly scene of the night shift, not knowing what to do with itself, from the point of having to lower the power from 1500 to 1600 megawatts, supposedly with an unstable reactor core to boot. Except the power level had already been lowered close to the lower boundary of the power range written in the testing program of 700 to 1000 megawatts. The operating reactivity margin was 9 rods higher than the minimum of 15, and all parameters were within regulation. In other words, the night shift inherited ideal conditions for the performance of the turbine rundown test. All they needed to do was begin it, and even the reactor would have shut itself down automatically. But that is not what happened. And what happened is sure as hell not what Comrade Homyuk introduces on the so-called scientific side of things. As opposed to getting the details right, Homyuk starts talking about Yuri Gagarin for some reason. The power of a few hundred scientists, concentrated in one woman. Finally, she wraps up the human problem created by the delay. Thus we arrive to the quote-unquote scientific problem created by the Kiev delay. But inside the reactor core, in the space between atoms themselves, something far more dangerous was forming. A poison. The time is 28 minutes past midnight. So, the time is not actually 28 minutes past midnight, because if you scroll 3 pages down the script, the next time you're teleported to into the control room, the power is still 1600 megawatts, and the time is actually 10 minutes past 11.
But I digress.
Homyuk passes the science baton to none other than Valery Legasov, whose palms are sweaty, mom's spaghetti, and who's ready to drop some xenon bombs, as he's been driven mad by the tick-tick-tick of the only fan in the courtroom. Same as Homyuk, Legasov locks eyes with the 6 scientists of the invisible jury. I am pleased to see some of my colleagues are here, from the Kachatov Institute and Mininergo. Homyuk straightens up. He's acknowledged them. He's thinking about them. There's a chance. Legasov proceeds to say that you don't need to be a nuclear scientist to understand what happened at Chernobyl, and then to prove that you don't need to be overly cocky either, even if you are a nuclear scientist. Let's observe him talking about the positive void coefficient. In an RBMK reactor of the type used at Chernobyl, there is something called a positive void coefficient. What does that mean? It means the more steam, the higher the reactivity. Which means more heat, which means more steam. It would appear we have a vicious cycle on our hands. And we would, if not for this. Legasov picks up a blue placard, negative temperature coefficient, and places it on the left column. Legasov then says, negative temperature coefficient. When nuclear fuel gets hotter, it gets less reactive. So, he stares at the board. Even after all this time, he still can't help but marvel at the science. He moves his hands between the columns of red and blue. Fuel increases reactivity, control rods and water reduce it, steam increases it, and the rise in temperature reduces it. This is the invisible dance that powers entire cities without smoke or flame. And it is beautiful. He turns back to the room. When things are normal. What HBO Legasov is trying to do here is pin the RBMK reactor being susceptible to a runaway reaction predicated on the positive void coefficient on the operators. What HBO Legasov is wholly ignorant of is that the actual science was far uglier than the simplistic delusions in his head. Remember that we were talking about VP Volkov's, who was the head of the IV Kachatov Institute research group on the reliability and safety of nuclear power plants with RBMK reactors, opinion on why Chernobyl Unit 4 exploded. We reduced it to 3 principal factors: the positive Scram effect, the positive power coefficient of reactivity, and incorrect operating procedures. Let's discuss that second factor now. The positive void coefficient of reactivity, or that the conversion of water in the RBMK core to steam, or voids, would increase reactivity, was important in a larger context. Let's open up INSAG 7, the report that serves as the top or most authoritative source on the causes of Chernobyl, and search for the word dominant. There are 2 instances of it in the document, the first on page 3. This page makes a meal of the topic, and is actually misleading. You see, the first 28 pages of INSAG 7 are what we call the international section, where international experts whose nuclear reactors at least don't blow up try not completely successfully to wrap their minds around nuclear reactors that do blow up. The first section of INSAG 7 explicitly defers to the following 2 Soviet sections, known as Annex 1 and Annex 2, for ironically more reliable information. Indeed, focusing on the 2 to 3 pages where we find the second instance of the word dominant in Annex 1 of INSAG 7 is going to give us a lot more insight into why an RBMK reactor core explodes than HBO Legasov's nonsense. The section begins with a design rule. Mind you, this is a design rule, not an operating rule. Article 3.2.2 of NSR 0474, as well as Article 2.2.3 of GSP 73, states that, when designing the reactor, it is desirable to ensure that the total power coefficient of reactivity is not positive under any operating conditions. If the total power coefficient of reactivity becomes positive under any operating conditions, the nuclear safety of the reactor during steady state, transient, and emergency operating conditions must be guaranteed in the design and explicitly proved. After the 3 Mile Island incident in the United States, the Soviets tightened this rule further. Paragraph 2.2.2 of the General Safety Provisions, OPB 82, states, as a rule, the fast power coefficient of reactivity should not be positive in any operational conditions of the nuclear power plant and under any conditions of the heat removal systems of the primary loop. Inside the Politburo, Boris Shabina gave a far more meaningful statement than inside the HBO courtroom he wasn't in. The main flaw of the reactor is the positive void coefficient of reactivity, which evolved into a positive fast power coefficient of reactivity in the conditions that developed. According to the safety requirements, the power coefficient must not be positive in any, even extraordinary, situations. Practical experience in operating RBMK reactors has shown that the value of a positive void coefficient of reactivity turned out to be much higher, twice as high as projected by the design. In other words, the science was ugly. So, the void coefficient was the dominant component of the total power coefficient of reactivity, which is what the design rule targets. A positive total power coefficient of reactivity means that if the power increases, reactivity will further increase. Summing the other coefficients of reactivity and signifying the reactor core being able to run away. A positive void coefficient alone wasn't disastrous. As Anatoly Dyatlov puts it, both in the INSAG experts report and in other documents, there is mention of the void coefficient of reactivity, whereas what should have been mentioned is the void coefficient of inadmissible magnitude. When the positive void coefficient becomes high enough to flip the total power coefficient positive, that is clearly inadmissible magnitude, as Soviet experts knew. So, who controlled that magnitude and how? Notice the sentence, these high positive values for the void coefficient of reactivity were the result of a desire to attain large fuel burnups, i.e., high economic efficiency. The identified factors were: this coefficient depends largely on the lattice pitch of the core and the core composition, number of control rods submerged in the core, number of additional absorbers installed, fuel enrichment, and fuel burnup. So, on the one hand, we have the lattice pitch of the core, which refers to the dimensions of the graphite blocks that comprised much of the core. In our reading, two mentions of this topic spring to mind. One is in a book by Chernobyl Deputy Chief Engineer for Science and Nuclear Safety at the time of the disaster, Nikolai Karpan. In considering why a number of recommendations for improving the nuclear safety of RBMK reactors were not implemented after the 1975 Leningrad incident, Karpan writes the following. Why were they not implemented in 1976? So far, only one explanation for this fact is known. It should be borne in mind that the lattice selected for the RBMK is optimal in terms of fuel burnup depth, and a significant change in the ratio of the number of uranium nuclei and the moderator makes the lattice suboptimal. This means that the scientific director, in order to ensure maximum efficiency of the reactor fuel cycle, deliberately decided to reduce the nuclear safety of the reactors. In addition to the Kurchatov Institute of Atomic Energy, Karpan also points a finger at Nikiat. The takeaway is that the very manner in which RBMK reactor cores were constructed was intended to maximize fuel burnup, which came at the expense of safety. Despite indications of risk, scientific and design authorities chose to err on the side of economy. Alexander N. Rumyantsev, who was present at the Kurchatov Institute in the formative years of the RBMK reactor, recalls a similar goal and choice. The graphite stack pitch selected for RBMK, for design reasons, at the level of 25 cm, with a design initial enrichment of uranium-235 at the level of 1.8%, is optimal in terms of achievable fuel burnup depth, including the plutonium production mode when converting RBMK reactors to a dual-purpose operating mode. However, with a step of 25 cm, the steam effect of reactivity for water, due to a decrease in the density of water during the formation of steam, for the expected equilibrium isotopic composition of the fuel, according to burnup, is always positive, and can significantly exceed the proportion of delayed neutrons. The general conclusion from the calculations performed was that the choice of a 25 cm pitch leads to the appearance of a significant positive steam reactivity effect, the consequence of which may be the occurrence of large and uncontrollable non-uniformities in energy release throughout the reactor volume. But by this time, the main design characteristics of the RBMK 1000 had already been approved, and it was no longer possible to change the graphite stack pitch. Proposals to reduce the graphite density to the equivalent of a 20 to 22 cm pitch, bubble graphite or backfilling the stack with graphite balls, were classified as practically unrealizable. In addition to the static lattice pitch, Annex 1 of INSAG 7 identifies the variable core composition as determining the magnitude of the void coefficient. These core composition elements are listed as number of control rods submerged in the core, number of additional absorbers installed, fuel enrichment, and fuel burnup. In reality, we can focus on just two, which were related: fuel burnup and the number of additional absorbers present in the core. Nikolai Karpan provides a table of measurements of Unit 4 of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, performed by the station's nuclear safety department he was a member of. The fuel enrichment is constant. It's the 2% you see in the heading of column number 4. Likewise, if you look at the second underlined column, that is the operating reactivity margin, or number of control rods submerged in the core. That value for these measurements is relatively constant too, at around twice the lower limit of the ORM. Look at the third and fourth underlined columns. These are the void and power coefficients of reactivity columns. You can see how dramatically the values change with a constant fuel enrichment and a constant well above minimum ORM. So beyond mostly static factors like the lattice pitch and fuel enrichment, what are the dynamic determinants of a void coefficient of inadmissibly high positive magnitude and a forbidden positive power coefficient? One is fuel burnup, which you see in column 2. Higher fuel burnup is enabled by the removal of additional absorbers in the core, which balance out the extra reactivity of fresher fuel. You can see the number of these absorbers in the first underlined column. With a fresh load of fuel, an RBMK reactor could contain 240 of these additional absorbers. At the time of the Chernobyl disaster, there was a single one of these absorbers remaining in the core. Here, the paramount significance of these additional absorbers from the horse's mouth. Director of Nikiet, the person who himself can be called the chief design engineer of RBMK reactors, Nikolai Dolezal. On the 26th of November 1986, chief designer, academician N.A. Dolezal, director of Nikiet, presented his vision of the causes of the accident to the investigator for especially important cases under the Prosecutor General of the USSR, Voskovtsev, MP, case number 1973, volume 45, pages 150 to 151. During the operation of the RBMK reactor with 2% enrichment, the effect of the steam coefficient is regulated by the installation of special absorbers, DP, in the channels, which is strictly provided for in the operating instructions. Until 26th of April 1986, it was not provided for, according to Kalpan. Deviation from them is unacceptable, as this makes the reactor uncontrollable. It should be added to the above that the operation of the reactor at low power, 6 to 7%, which took place at the beginning of the accident, requires, in order to avoid power acceleration, special attention to the value of the steam reactivity coefficient, which was obviously overlooked. And in order to maintain such a low power level, contrary to the regulations, the absorbers were removed from the core. The constant striving of the creators of a nuclear reactor for its highest efficiency is associated, in particular, with the need to remove as much as possible from the core elements that are harmful and parasitically absorbing neutrons. Among others, one of these elements is the water remaining in the lower part of the channel. In order to avoid this influence, some lower parts of the regulator rod, of a certain strictly calculated size, is made of non-absorbing material, thus displacing a corresponding amount of water in this channel, which was previously the absorber. When the necessary and sufficient amount of additional absorption agents, DP, is introduced into the reactor core, the effect of such displacement of water in the regulator channels, due to its relative insignificance, does not affect the overall behaviour of the core. If these absorbers were not enough in the reactor, then the development of power in the reactor is possible. So, according to Dolezal, these additional absorbers you may not have heard of were the primary determinants of the safety and stability of RBMK reactors. Not only did they keep the void and power coefficients in check, but apparently they could even negate the positive Scram effect. Dolezal claims they were removed in violation of operating instructions. However, neither the 1986 Soviet report to the Vienna meeting, the International INSAG-1 report that was the product of the Vienna meeting and subsequent discussions, nor the INSAG-7 report include any mention of an operating violation in the removal of these additional absorbers, which occurred gradually over the course of about 2 years as fuel burnt up. If you Control-F additional absorbers, in the 1986 Soviet report to the Vienna meeting, you'll come across this paragraph buried on page 302. The composition of the RBMK core depends on the operating cycle. During the first part of the operating cycle with these reactors, the core contains channels with fuel of low burnup and a large quantity of additional absorbers needed for compensation of excess reactivity. As burnup proceeds, the fuel inventory in the core changes continuously. During this transitional period of the cycle, the core contains channels with fuel of different burnup levels, additional absorbers of different effectiveness, and also channels filled with water. The transitional period of reactor operation ends after all or almost all additional absorbers have been extracted from the core, and they have been replaced by fuel assemblies. The reactor is then operated in continuous on-load refueling regime, in which a refueling machine is used to replace spent fuel assemblies by fresh ones. The removal of additional absorbers from the RBMK reactor core was neither limited nor left to the discretion of the operators. It was a mandated action to maximize fuel burnup and the economy of RBMK reactors. Annex 2 of INSAG 7 was written by the top institutes, like the Kurchatov Institute of Atomic Energy and NIKIAT. The expert establishment remained quiet on many things in this notably short section, but it includes this paragraph on page 106. The dependence of the effective multiplication factor on the coolant density in an RBMK is largely determined by the various kinds of absorbers which have been placed in the core. During initial loading of the core, which includes approximately 240 additional absorbers containing boron, coolant vaporization in a fuel channel produces a negative reactivity effect. The increase in steam quality which occurs during normal online refueling at rated power with a 30 rod reactivity margin causes a positive reactivity rise. Normal online refueling refers to the constant mode of operation subsequent to the removal of all additional absorbers, when spent fuel rods are periodically replaced by fresh ones, through the use of the giant refueling machine mounted above the reactor core. It was the planned absence of additional absorbers, coupled with firmer qualities like the lattice pitch and the low fuel enrichment, that created the positive void coefficient of inadmissible magnitude and the positive power coefficient of reactivity that enabled the reactor runaway. The Chernobyl operators did not control these factors, but there were multiple dirty tricks played on the operators. Somehow the same high measurements of the positive void coefficient present at Chernobyl Unit 4 in 1986 had been obtained going all the way back to Leningrad Unit 1 in 1975. Sources on this date at least back to 1977 and 1980. In 1976, it was decided to improve stability by increasing the fuel enrichment from 1.8 to 2%. However, even with that fuel enrichment, as fuel burnup increased to 1100 to 12 megawatts times D/T per fuel assembly, and with an authorized operating reactivity margin, ORM, corresponding to 26 to 30 manual control rods, the void coefficient of reactivity approached +5 beta-F. The relatively high ORM being brought up here is very important. Why? Because some of these slime balls of the preceding international section of INSAG 7 were writing patently false statements like these. In the discussion of the scenario, the operators seemed not to be aware of the other reason for the importance of the ORM, which was the extreme effect it could have on the void and power coefficients, and, in fact, the safety significance of the reduction of the ORM is much greater than was indicated in the INSAG-1 report. Some people behind the scenes were trying to twist the ORM into something much more important than it was. Not coincidentally, as other allegations against the operators were being refuted. How these statements ended up in the international section of INSAG 7 is a very interesting, unanswered question, given their plain contradiction is merely 20 to 25 pages away. Page 36 of Annex 1 of INSAG 7 brings up something else. In addition to an ORM difference of 6 to 8 control rods, under 15 supposedly having an extreme effect on the inadmissible coefficients of reactivity. In reality, the Soviets thereby reduced the void coefficient to a permissible value by stuffing 80 additional absorbers in RBMK reactor cores, in addition to actually raising the lower ORM limit to 30. An argument has been made that it was the power level, in particular under 700 megawatts, that led to these coefficients. Page 36 points out these coefficients were measured at power levels over 50%, or 1600 megawatts. So it was neither the power level, nor the ORM operators were faulted for, that created the runaway conditions of the reactor. Page 36 concludes with the following statement. In view of the lack of calculations on coefficients of reactivity at power levels of less than 50%, the Commission is bound to conclude that the designers of the reactor evidently did not expect any dangerous characteristics in the behaviour of the reactor at low power levels, and notes that they did not impose any restrictions on reactor operation at low power levels before the accident on the 26th of April 1986. So how does this happen? Page 37 of INSAG 7 gives us the expected, albeit incomplete answer. Scientific misunderstanding. The first paragraph begins with the Kurchatov Institute of Atomic Energy and Nikiet analysing what happens to reactor reactivity when water changes to steam inside the core. According to the calculated dependence, during coolant vaporization in the core, reduction of coolant density, the positive reactivity initially increases to plus 2 beta F, and then the reactivity decreases as the coolant density approaches zero. Full steaming all the channels or coolant vaporization in the core, and becomes negative. This leads to the reactor shutting itself down, even if the reactor control and protection system does not affect the reactivity. This was why problems of shutting the reactor down in the event of coolant leaks were not considered. So RBMK scientists and designers calculated that initially positive reactivity would emerge, only to decrease as voiding progressed and become negative. To them, this indicated such innate stability that the reactor control and protection system wouldn't even be needed. And apparently, consequently, problems of shutting the reactor down in the event of coolant leaks were not considered. The first paragraph then concludes with the following. In fact, according to calculations made in 1980, 1985 and 1987, when the water in the core is replaced by steam, there is an increase in positive reactivity to plus 5 beta F, which leads not to the reactor shutting itself down, but to a large increase in positive reactivity and a reactor runaway. The graph version of these statements is found on page 127, with curve 1 being the design calculations and curve 2 being reality. Or, as Anatoly Dyatlov put it in his article, Why INSAG Has Still Got It Wrong, curve 2 of figure 3 is shown in INSAG 7 as the actual dependence at the same time of the accident on the 26th of April. This is a Jesuitical approach, neither a lie nor the truth. A similar void effect existed at all RBMK reactors, and not only on the 26th of April. The curve was obtained several years prior to the accident by an employee of the Kurchatov Institute, V. Ivanov, and was subsequently confirmed by measurements. The administration did not believe Ivanov. They understood that an explosion threatened, but they did not check this out either by calculation or by experiment. So there you have it. One might ask why Ivanov did not squeal. Only one person squealed, and that was V.I. Volkov, who was quickly disposed of with an invalidity pension. After checking, the V.I. is a typo or mistake, and this should be the same V.P. Volkov we have referenced before. The bottom of page 37 of INSAG 7 offers an attempt at a root explanation. There are a number of explanations for the poor quality of the calculational analysis of the safety of the design. These include the fact that, until recently, Soviet computer techniques were chronically outdated, and the standard of computer codes was very low. Three-dimensional non-stationary neutron thermal hydraulic models are required in order to calculate the physical parameters of an RBMK reactor, under different operating conditions. Such models first became available only shortly before the Chernobyl accident, and were not really developed until after the accident. The Commission concludes that the design of the RBMK 1000 reactor and the thermal hydraulic characteristics of the core predetermine the positive void and power coefficients of reactivity under steady-state refueling conditions. The nuclear safety of the reactor with such coefficients was not guaranteed and explicitly proved either for operation at rated power or for intermediate power levels ranging from the minimum controllable power level to the rated level. This was also not done for transient and accident regimes. As a result of the misguided selection of the core's physical and design parameters by the designers, the RBMK 1000 was a dynamically unstable system with regard to power and steam quality perturbations. The steam quality, in its turn, was dependent on many parameters characterizing the reactor state. Or, as inventor of the RBMK reactor shortly prior to the startup of the first unit of the Leningrad nuclear power plant, and his abrupt and suspicious death in 1973, Savily Moiseyevich Feinberg put it, "Sasha, we have created something like this, that the human mind can no longer comprehend." Long story short, what in fact was normal were inadmissible void and power coefficients of reactivity that operators had no control over. Indeed, coefficients they were misled about. This safety document more than halves the void coefficients of the 4 Chernobyl reactors, and shows negative power coefficients of reactivity, with no additional absorbers for every reactor. Nikolai Karpan's name appears on it. Dyatlov includes it in his book as evidence for Chernobyl's nuclear safety department supplying operators with false figures, misrepresenting the safety of each unit. How this sort of thing happened remains a mystery. Part 4 of this series of videos will pick up our critical analysis of the HBO miniseries Episode 5 script, with the ironic matter of xenon poisoning during the Kyiv delay. Some critical details from earlier in this part will carry over to the next one.